Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Finholm recording a lesson for 7th grade math at Red Wing High School. This is concept number 9, lesson number part number 2. So part number 1, reviewed and practiced multiplying rational numbers. And now you'll see that we're in our student workbooks again. This time we're on lesson 1-9, which can be found on page 57 of your math workbook. And we're going to look at dividing rational numbers. You can see here in our opening example on the start of lesson 1-9 that they show us that that multiplication is repeated, and so division can be broken apart the same way. And we can think about that. Another thing to note about our division rules is that the sign rules are positive times a positive, negative times a negative, and one of each. Those rules are the same for division as they are for multiplication. All right, so let's jump in. So I'm now turning in my student workbook to page 58. And we can see here a breakdown of an example. Again, you can hear and see that animation in your online textbook with some extra guidance. So I'm going to jump down and look at the try it problem on the bottom of page 58. So suppose that the volume of water in the rain barrel decreased by 4 5/8 gallons in 4 minutes. What will the change be in the volume of water after 1 minute? So just like our multiplication practice for this concept, in order to divide fractions, we have to have everything as decimals or everything as fractions. When we start mixing forms of numbers, it causes extra risk of error. And so you'll notice it's decreasing, so we have a negative, and I'm going to actually write a step above this. So I want to take my 4 5/8 of gallons, and I want to figure out or divide by 4 minutes because I want to know the amount of gallons in 1 minute. So I'm going to divide it up equally amongst the 4 minutes. In order to do that, we're going to use our concept, our 6th grade skill that we reviewed in part 1 video, which was to go around the horn. 8 times 4 is 32. 32 plus 5 is 37. Okay. And notice here we took 4 and we made it into a fraction by writing that fraction as 4/1. All right, so now here come the rules or the new steps for dividing fractions. It's kind of like the keep change. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to keep the first number. So I still have negative 37/8. Okay. I'm going to change the division to multiplication, and I'm going to flip the second fraction. So 4/1 is going to become 1/4. Okay. Or we're going to multiply by the reciprocal would be our use of our technical math vocabulary. So dividing a fraction is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal or the keep flip change, right? We keep the first fraction, we flip the second, we change that division into multiplication. And now we get to do exactly like we did in part 1 of this concept. We're going to multiply our numerators. 37 times 1 is 37. And we multiply 8 times 4, which is 32. When I pull out 32 out of 32, that gets me my whole 1 and leaves me with 5 left over. And so my rain barrel is going to lose 1 5/32 each minute. Okay, so just one more time to remind you, if we have to remember one key thing from this example, it's this keep flip change. Okay, we keep the first, we flip the second, we change to multiplication. So another way to say that is to divide fractions we multiply by the reciprocal. Okay. To divide fractions, we multiply by the reciprocal. All right, let's look at a few more examples. So here we can see an example problem. I'm now on page 59 of your workbook. So now we see an example that shows us a setup which is a little different. It's still dividing two fractions, but they write it as a complex fraction where we have a fraction in the numerator and a fraction in the denominator. Notice that that simply means we take the top divided by the bottom, the numerator divided by the denominator. And so we can separate it out and turn it from a complex fraction into a problem that's dividing two fractions. So let's work through a couple of those. Okay. In particular, I want to work through letter A, where it shows us this idea that we have a complex fraction to work with. So if I have 1 2/5 over -1/5. That's the same as saying 1 2/5 divided by -1/5. Okay, so once we take that complex fraction and we turn it into a division expression, now we can follow our steps that we just learned. 1 2/5, we're going to go around the horn. 5 times 1 is 5, plus 2 is 7. So I have 7/5. Now I'm going to keep flip change. I keep 7/5. I flip -1/5 into -5/1, and I change my division to multiplication. That should be a negative sign. We'll make that a little clearer. Okay. Now we multiply just like we did in part 1 of this concept. 5 and 5 can simplify. They're both divisible by 5. 7 times -1 is -7, and 1 times 1 is 1. So if we simplify that even further, -7/1 is just -7. Okay. All right. Let's look at letter C. Of course, letter B, we could turn these decimals back into fractions and use these same steps, or because they're already both in decimal form, we could use our calculator to help us divide them out as decimals. Okay. So I'm going to focus my examples on the fraction form because I know you guys are pretty comfortable with your calculators. So looking at letter C, I have 7/8 divided by -3/4. A positive divided by a negative tells me I'm for sure going to have a negative answer. So now I can focus on my fractions. I'm going to keep the 7/8. I'm going to flip the 3/4 into 4/3, and I'm going to change the division to multiplication. When I do that, now I have something that I can cross simplify. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 8 divided by 4 is 2. 7 times 1 is 7. 2 times 3 is 6. So I have -7/6. Well, again, we want to turn that back into the simplest version we can, and I can pull out one whole. 7 minus 6 leaves me with 1/6 left over. Okay. So there is our answer for letter C. In letters, in example 3 and in the try it problems on the bottom of this page, you'll see that we have a mix and match of different types and different formats. Okay, so again, reminding us that in order to divide, everything needs to be in the same form. Okay, everything needs to be in the same form. So to help us get these set up, okay, I'm going to help you set them up. First, we need to turn both of these into fractions or into mixed numbers to work with. So if we look at example A, we have -1 1/3. First, I'm going to deal with those negatives. A negative divided by a negative is going to give me a positive answer. So a negative divided by a negative becomes positive, just like those sign rules in part 1 of this concept. So I've got 1 1/3 divided by 1 6/10. I take that 0.6 and I turn it into a fraction. In order to divide these, I have to turn them into improper fractions. So I'm going to go around the horn just like we learned in 6th grade. 3 times 1 is 3, plus 1 is 4. 10 times 1 is 10, plus 6 is 16. Now this looks like I'm going to have to do some really big numbers, which is really kind of gross and yucky, right? But if we remember, the first step of dividing is to multiply by the reciprocal. So 4/3, I keep the 4/3. I change the division to multiplication, and I flip my fraction. Now I actually see something that's going to help us. 4 and 16 can be cross-simplified. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 16 divided by 4 is 4. 1 times 10 is 10. And 3 times 4 is 12. Now I have a final answer of 10/12, which both of those are even, so I can divide them both by 2 and simplify it to an answer of 5/6. Okay, so again, notice all of the steps involved. First, we had to turn them both into mixed numbers and get rid of that decimal. Next, we went around the horn. Once we had them both in fraction form, I kept the first, I changed to multiplication, I flipped the second. Once I turned this into a multiplication problem, I was able to cross simplify, multiply my numerators, and multiply my denominators. It seems like a lot of steps, so let's write them down in word form so that you have them to follow along, especially for those of you who are more concrete sequential in your learning style. Okay, so you can see here they give you as a key concept the sign rules, okay, which are a review from our part 1 video. But then let's also, I'm going to move my video screen up there so we have more room to write. Let's write down these steps, okay? So the first step was to turn it into fractions, okay? So make everything into fractions. Now that might mean that you just have to turn the decimal into a fraction. It might mean that you have to take a mixed number and go around the horn to turn it into a fraction, but we have to make everything into a fraction. Next, we keep, we change, and we flip. Okay, so we keep the first fraction, we change to multiplication, we flip our second fraction. Third, we simplified as much as we could. Anything that could be divided by the same number on the top and the bottom, we cross-simplified like we learned how to do when simplifying fractions in 5th and 6th grade. And finally, our last step was to multiply. And when we multiply fractions, we multiply the tops and we multiply the bottoms. So those are the steps in order to match the practice examples that we just worked through.